So quite possibly the most important of all of the authentication methods for iOS developers has now become sign in with Apple. For those of you who don't know, Apple made it a rule, I think a couple years ago now, that if your app supports authentication, so signing into email, Google, or anything, and it's an iOS app, meaning it's on the Apple App Store, it is a requirement to also include sign in with Apple. So you can't just do Google anymore. You have to do Google and Apple, but you can do just Apple if that's something that you want to do. Kind of funny how that works. But the positive thing here is that in order to sign in with Apple, the user is basically signing in with their iCloud account. And for the most part, I would say 99.9% of people on iPhones have iCloud accounts and can therefore sign in with Apple. So almost everybody using your iOS app is going to have an iCloud account and can therefore sign in with Apple. That's kind of the benefit here. It's kind of a catch-all for iOS apps. One big downside that you guys are going to see is that there is no super SwiftUI elegant way to get sign in with Apple in our Xcode project. And I do actually expect Apple to probably change the API in the near future, but there's a sign in with Apple button in the SwiftUI framework, which is super convenient, but unfortunately, at this time at least, that method is not compatible with the Firebase authentication. And so because of that, we're gonna write a whole lot of extra code just to make this whole flow seamless and elegant, quite frankly, in our application. So because that code gets a little more difficult, what we're gonna do is basically first implement a very basic beginner level version of what we're trying to do. And then we're gonna take a couple extra minutes at the end of the video to kind of clean up our code, make it more reusable, decouple it from our view, and make it much more of a final reusable feature for all of our applications. All right. Welcome back, everyone. We are, I guess, moving kind of slowly through this playlist. I feel like each of these videos have been longer than I wanted them to be. There's just a lot of code that we have to write to get this whole flow working. I originally was going to do this whole series without making any sort of app, but I think it was more confusing than actually seeing the UI here of logging in, logging out. So a little extra time, but hopefully it adds some clarity. Anyway, a couple of videos ago, we set up Firebase project. A couple of videos ago, we set up sign in with email. The last video, we did sign in with Google, and now we're going to do sign in with Apple. If you're just joining, you should watch the beginning of this playlist before watching this one. We already have a mini app set up. We have an authentication manager where we have a bunch of functions for authentication through Firebase, and we're just going to add and build onto that in this video. So if you are just joining, you got to add Firebase to your project. You got to import the Firebase Auth SDK and set up your own kind of little UI. It's basically a logout screen and a sign in screen. And we're just going to add a sign in with Apple button. But even if you're just joining, you can probably follow most of the code without having to redo the whole course. But anyway, let's get going here. So we're going to start by adding Firebase sign in with Apple to our app. It is important to note that any iOS application that requires a user to sign in with an authentication method. So if you have Google or any other sign in method on your app, you are required by Apple to have sign in with Apple as an option. Any iOS user must have an option to sign in with Apple if there's authentication on your app. You will literally get rejected from the App Store if you don't have that. So if you're going to do it, you got to add it. We're going to go into sign in methods here in our Firebase console, add a new provider, and of course, we're going to add in Apple. We're going to enable it for Apple, and we don't have a services ID, not required, and save. I'm going to click on this just to open up the documentation here, and let's save it. We got this applied. And what is that documentation? So there's essentially a couple extra steps we need to do to sign in with Apple because Apple requires some extra encryption when we go through the sign in with Apple process. So let's come down here and figure out how we can configure sign in with Apple. You are going to need to be part of the Apple developer program in order to do this. So you can go create an Apple developer account. I think it's $99 a year on, I think it's developer.apple.com. If you don't want to do that, you can still write all this code and it obviously won't work at the end of the day, but the code will be the same whether or not it's going to work. So first thing we need to do is connect Sign with Apple as a certificate identifier or profile on our developer site. We can actually do this from Xcode now. This documentation is a little outdated. So let's go to our Xcode project. And firstly, if you go to the project navigator and you go to signing and you click on the target and go to signing capabilities, your team must be an account that has a developer access. So if I go to an account that does not have developer access, I try to add in a capability of sign in with Apple, it's not going to be here. If I switch to a team that has developer access and I add a capability and I go sign in with Apple, it's going to pop up here. So that's how you'll know if you're signed into an account that's a developer account. And we're going to add in the sign in with Apple capability to our app. And this is awesome because it automatically creates the certificate in our developer account for us. We don't have to go in and manually do that anymore. I'm getting an error here that my bundle identifier is wrong. It's because I just switched teams. So if you're getting that, you have to change the bundle ID to something that's valid for your new team. So I'm just going to change my bundle ID quick or at least the com dot and my organization name. And it looks like that works. After I do change the bundle ID, I'm going to have to change my Firebase settings as well, because now it's a different bundle ID and Firebase needs to know that. So if you are running into that problem, we get a printout here, project bundle ID is in service with the info.plist. So I think we need to go to our info.plist bundle ID and then fix that as well. Let's build that, see if it still prints out. And I think there's one more place. I think on the Firebase console in the project settings, we also need to change our bundle ID down here. We actually need to change our app. Oh no. That's a buzzkill. All right. We need to add another app. All right. So we're going to add a second app real quick to our Firebase project. So this is if you had an Android app, you would go through this process. I'm adding a second iOS app. I'm going to add it with my new bundle ID. I'm going to add it with my new bundle ID. Sorry guys, if you don't have this problem, then you don't need to deal with this, of course. Let's go ahead and download the new info.plist file. Let's bring the new info.plist file into our app here, which should have our new bundle ID. I'm going to delete the first one, move to trash. All right. Sorry guys, 1 second. We got that set up. Let's finish this up and go next. We did that already. Continue to console. Let's delete the first one that we no longer need. And I think we are good to go again. Let's run this. All right. So we've added the capability for sign in with Apple to our project. And we've set up we're on a developer account. We have our bundle ID correct now. And we're back in here. Awesome. Let's go back to the Google documentation and enable sign in with Apple. We just did that. If you use any of Google's Firebase features to send emails, including email verification, I don't think we need this because we're not sending emails to the users. Enable Apple as a sign-in provider, add Firebase project, add the sign-in method to our Firebase project. We did that already. And sign in with Apple and authenticate with Firebase. All right. To authenticate with Apple, we first need to sign into the user's Apple account using the Authentication Services Framework. This is a framework that comes built into Xcode provided by Apple that basically that modal where you sign in with your Apple ID. After we get that, we're going to want to generate a nonce, which is basically a random string that's generated using cryptography. You can tell people that you are a cryptographer after this. And this gives us a function of what the nonce should look like. We then create a hash value from the nonce, and then we're literally using CryptoKit, Apple's cryptography kit, to do this flow. We want to then present the modal, just like we did with sign in with Google, where we presented the Google modal. Here, we're going to present the Apple modal. Then there are some delegate functions. So we need to conform some class. We want to conform to this delegate. And then when we did complete authorization, it looks like this function will run. And then if we did complete with error, this function would run. And if we look at this function, it's very similar to the sign in with Google function. So basically we get a credential, and then from that credential, we want to get the token. And then we're going to pass the tokens in to the Firebase function to get a Firebase credential. And then we're going to sign them into Firebase using that credential. Very similar flow to what we did with sign in with Google. Just a one extra step, which is adding some of this cryptography. So let's get this going and see and write some code for now. So let's get this going and write some code here. Jump back to our Xcode project. We're going to go back to our auth view. So this view is where we want to get our sign in. All right. So we are back on our authentication view, and we want to add a sign in with Apple button. Sign in with Apple button. We need to import the authentication services framework. So import authentication services. I just want to show you guys this real quick. So this should be on request. It's going to give us on request. It's going to give us a request back. You don't have to type this in, guys. Let's just leave that blank for a second. This will be the result, and leave that blank for a second. Let's see what it looks like. Cool. And let's just give this a frame with a height of 55 for a second. And that is what the sign in with Apple button looks like. I'm sure you guys have all seen it before. I want to note here that if we go into the human interface guidelines that Apple provides to developers, you can literally just Google human interface guidelines, or you can Google sign in with Apple button, and this will come up. There's a very specific way that this button needs to look. So on a dark background, it needs to be white with black text. And then on a white background, it needs to be black with white text, as we just saw. So they have very specific design patterns here. So all it can say is sign in, sign up, or continue. It needs to have the Apple icon there. And they're showing us here, they can't be white on white. It can't be black on black. Very specific guidelines. If you go and try to make your sign in with Apple button fit your color scheme, so maybe your color scheme is red and you make this button red, Apple will reject your app. This is exactly how the button needs to look, full stop. So we are back on our SwiftUI project and we have this button. Now, you would think because Apple is requiring us to do sign with Apple, they would give us a very convenient way to create a button like this and then authenticate into Firebase. The problem is this button does not actually give us back the token that we want in Firebase, which is extremely annoying on Apple's side. Like, at least they should just make a button like Google did that we can then put any action into, right? But we can't, because this is a very specific action that we have to put in here. Maybe this is Apple hinting that they don't want us to use Firebase auth and they just want us to use their sign-in methods. But we're going to use Firebase auth, which means we actually can't use the SwiftUI button, but we need to still use a button that looks like this. So what we can do is take the UIKit button, convert it to SwiftUI, and then put an action on that. And that's what we're going to do now. All right. So let's just keep it in this file for now, and then we're going to move it to another file later. So we still need to import the authentication services. And up here, I'm going to create a struct, and I'm going to call it sign in with Apple button, and I'll call it view representable. Conform to UI view representable and open the brackets. And for those of you who are following my playlists that have not taken the advanced course yet, UI view representable is how we convert a UIKit view into SwiftUI. We create a representable version of it in SwiftUI, basically. And on the advanced playlist on my YouTube channel, I have a video on how to do this in detail. So if you're interested, go check that out and come on back. But otherwise, this is going to be a super simple view representable. In order to conform to this, we have to add two functions here. Make UI view, which should just pop up. What is going on? I'm going to close the canvas for a second while we do this. Make the code a little bit bigger. Make UI view, and then one more function, which is update UI view. Cool. What do we need to do here? All right. So what kind of view do we want to return? Well, we want to return an AS authorization ID, Apple ID button. This is the UIKit version of that button. And so here, let's just return this button. And we're going to look for the initializer with the type and style. And now there's a bunch of different types here, and there's a bunch of different styles here. And so let's just be able to customize this. So let's inject the type and style that we want. So up here, I'm going to say let type of type. It looks like we need an AS authorization ID button type. And let's say style of type this. And we're going to pass in the type. And we're going to pass in the style. All right. And since this is the only thing in this function, we don't need the keyword return here. It just knows that. And then the last thing is the view is now an AS authorization ID button. So the update view, the view type is actually this as well. All right. That is all the code we need to convert the UIKit button to SwiftUI. So now we're going to come down here. I'm going to delete the sign in with Apple button. I'm going to delete the sign in with Apple button, and let's just create a sign in with Apple button view representable. Let's give it default type and let's make it black. I'm going to open up the canvas real quick. Let's see what this looks like. Hopefully it works. Sweet. Looks exactly the same. If we change the type to, let's see, continue, it'll say continue with Apple. We can customize it to say sign in, sign up. I'm just going to keep it default. We can also change it to white or black. So if you're supporting dark mode, you can toggle which color you want. Luckily, this wasn't very hard to replicate from UIKit. I would hope Apple makes a SwiftUI version of just this button in the near future. But we want to add an action when we click on this button. So this is a button, so it's clickable, but the function would then be like inside the, we'd have to make a coordinator. So what we're going to do is actually disable this actual button. So it's not clickable right now like it is. So we're just going to say dot allows hit testing. Hit testing means like taps from the user, false. So we can't click it. And now I'm going to add a regular button, like a SwiftUI button here, an action and a label. All right. And so now this view, the view of the button is not allowed to be tapped, but this button is still tapped. So we can still tap it here. And now we can do a custom action. All right. So now we can do the same thing that we did in our Google sign-in, where we call viewModel.SignInWithApple and then continue from there. Cool. So let's get going on that. I'm going to copy this code and I'm going to paste it here, and let's do sign in Apple. And then let's create that function. So let's go up to the view model. I'm going to create another function here, sign in Apple. And obviously we don't want our Google helper. So let's see what's happening. We obviously don't even want sign in with Google. So let's just get rid of that as well. Let's go back to the Firebase docs, back to our origin, see what it told us to do. Firstly, it's for every request, you need to generate a random nonce. All right. I am not a cryptographer. I assume you are not as well. So I am not going to be making my own nonce. I'll just use the one that they have here. Let's copy this back to our app. Let's create a function here called random nonce string. I'm just going to highlight all of the code here. Hold Control I just to format it a little bit. We'll zoom out. This looks good. All right. So this is just generates a nonce, returns a string. So let's say let nonce equals random nonce string. And now we got our nonce. Back to Firebase docs. Next, we need to be able to create a hash value from nonce. So copy that, go back to our code. Let's create another function here. SHA. And we want to create it from the nonce. So up here, we're going to say, let's say, I don't know, SHA, let SHA equals SHA-256, and we'll input our nonce. All right. And it looks like this is just creating some sort of hash value for it. And we don't have access to this because we must have to import a framework, maybe CryptoKit. Let's come back here, import CryptoKit. Does that error go away? Yes, ma'am. All right. Firebase docs. What do we got to do next? I love how Apple makes this so complicated for us. I'll start sign in with Apple flow, get a current nonce. All right, so let's copy this function, start signing with Apple flow. I'm going to put it up above our nonce logic. All right, so let's see. It's actually creating the random nonce already. And then current nonce. So in the docs, they're setting just a variable in the class called current nonce. So let's do that as well. Move it up here. I'll just say variable current nonce. I'm going to make it private. I'm just going to make it private. All right, we set the current nonce. Then we get the Apple ID provider. We do the SHA function. So it looks like it's doing all that for us already. And then let's see. Read a delegate, and we need a presentation context provider. All right, so let's do the delegate first. Come back to the docs. To handle Apple's response, you need an implementation of the AS authorization controller delegate. So that is right here, and it's basically two functions: did complete authorization, did complete error. All right, and so I'm just going to copy it for now. Let's come back to our code and let's conform to it. So I'm going to create an extension. Let's paste in that code. And we are going to extend our view model. So authentication view model conforms to this. All right. We got a lot of bulk code here that we're going to have to clean up. Let's make this nice. Cool. Cannot declare a conformance because authentication view model does not inherit NS object. NS object is basically a special type of object in Swift. All we need to do is make the class conform to NS object. All right. We'll come down here and now we got to write some code. All right. So did complete with authorization. If we did complete, let's see, we get a credential. We get the current nonce, which we just set up in the last function. We try to get the token, we try to get the token string, and we get that credential, and then we call sign it. All right, so firstly, we know this sign in method. We're going to use our Firebase manager, which we set up several videos ago. I'm going to go back to my authentication manager, and I have a function from the last video. We have sign in with a credential that gets the auth data result and converts it to an auth data result model. We're going to reuse that again. So if you don't have this, this is the function right here. Auth data result model is just a very simple data model. This is the whole class right here. All right. So now let's just create a sign in with Apple function. So I'm just going to copy this one and here, and we don't know what this is going to be yet. So we'll just keep it as a string. And it looks like we need to call OAuth provider.credential, and with this provider ID here. So let's paste it here. Let's say let credential equals OAuth provider credential. Let's one line it just to make it easier to read. Apple.com must be some specific, I guess this is the provider ID that we had from up here, actually. I like that. So the provider option is the provider ID, which is what we already have a function called get providers. So let's add that while we're here. We'll say case Apple equals apple.com, it looks like. So here we're going to add in, instead of writing the string directly, let's say auth provider option dot apple dot raw value. Let's pass in a token. So it'll look like this as well. The tokens.id token and tokens.access token. We haven't made whatever this tokens is going to be yet. It's a string right now. So obviously this is not going to work. We're going to fix that in 1 second. Let's change this to sign in with Apple, of course. Let's go back to our code here. So we know eventually we're going to have to call that function, which is asynchronous. So we need a task. And we're going to call try await auth manager shared dot sign in Apple. And we need to pass in something. So not this credential because we're doing that in that function. So here we need to pass in token string and an Apple ID token. So let's try to convert this Apple ID credential into the token and the string that we want here. So I'm going to create outside of the class here, I'm going to create a struct called sign in with Apple result. And that's going to have a token of type string. And it looks like we also need the nonce. So let's say let nonce of type string. Let's pass that into our auth manager. So this function will have this, and this will be our dot token. And it looks like not a nonce, and it looks like not an access token, but a nonce. Why are we getting an error here? Oh, there we go. All right. Cool. Coming back down, let's try to simplify some code now. So we don't need this anymore. We don't need this comment. Let's write some guard statements and keep this simple. So they have an if let. I prefer guard. It's a little bit cleaner. Let's say guard, and let's try to figure this out here. Let Apple ID credential equals this. Cool. What else? Let ID token equals this. Yeah, we definitely need an ID token. Okay. Let token string equals this. Okay, definitely need that. And it looks like we need a nonce here too. So we'll say let nonce. We'll say else, and we'll just print error for now and return. So if this fails, obviously we can't go and sign them in because we need all this data. If this is successful, we then can get a result. We'll say let result equals sign in with Apple result. We'll pass in our token ID token string. I think that's it. And the nonce. And then we can call this function here, right? We can pass in let's call this tokens. We'll pass in the tokens. All right, let's clean up all of this by just deleting it. We're back here. And this is looking pretty damn good so far. One thing we're going to need to do now. So the problem is when we called the sign in with Google, right? It was one single asynchronous function. And then we knew if it completed, we could set show sign in view equal to false. Unfortunately, the Apple method is not going to be like that. This is not going to work because if I click show sign in with Apple right now, well, we're not actually calling it. It starts this sign in flow when we call it, and then it presents this view controller. And you'll notice this function doesn't return a value because Apple loves to use delegate methods to make our life nice and confusing. So what happens is this function executes, it presents the modal, and then when that modal finishes, these functions down here, completely separate from what we called, are going to run. So now we need a way to kick back to our application after getting from these functions. So we're going to change this in a second, but for right now, what we're going to do is basically just set a value in our view model to true. So we'll just say here, we'll create an @published var. Let's say did sign in with Apple of type bool. We'll set it equal to false. And so down here, if they did sign in with Apple, if this succeeds, so let's do a do and a catch in here. Let's try that. If this does succeed and we get to this line of code, then we know we signed in successfully. And so we'll say did sign in with Apple equals true. And then in our view, where are we? Let's go down to the sign with Apple button. So we want to delete this code because just because this completes successfully does not mean that we did sign in, right? Because this is just going to be that first method that kicks off the code. It's not the delegate method on the completion side. So this is not going to be correct, at least not for right now. And then what we're going to want to do is just observe that change. So on change of, so if the view model dot did sign in with Apple changes value, we're going to get the new value of it. So we'll say if new value is equal to true. So if did sign in with Apple equal to true. Another way of writing that is just like this. Then what do we want to do? And then obviously we want to set show sign in view equal to false. All right, almost done, guys. Let's come back up here. We have one more error, which is the presentation provider context provider. And what that is, essentially, it needs to know what view controller to use to present. In the Google SDK, we needed to find the top view controller. Here, we need some delegate method to conform to AS authorization controller presentation context providing. And Apple's really keeping it simple for us. So let's do something that conforms to that. Let's see if that's in the Google Docs here. And it is not. How convenient. At least I don't see it. No. All right. Anyway, it's really not that difficult. All we need to do is conform. Let's go to where's our other extension? Here is our extension for this. And now we're going to need to extend this. Let's come down here, extension, authentication view model conforms to this. And I think there's a presentation anchor is what we need here. We basically need to just return some sort of anchor for it to present on. And we're just going to present. And what we're going to present is the utilities dot shared dot top view controller dot view dot window. So just like the Google SDK, we need to find the top view controller and then send that. Here, we're just going to get the top view controller and show the window, which is basically like the same thing. The window is like the container for the view controller. Unfortunately, this cannot be optional. So we're gonna have to force unwrap it, which is pretty dangerous, honestly. So let's try to make this a little bit safer. What we're gonna do is actually, instead of extending our view model, we're going to extend any view controller. So any UI view controller at all. Then we'll have it conform to this. We'll again add our presentation anchor. And now we're just going to take this part of the code. So we'll return self.view.window. So any view controller we know does have a view and then it will have a window. So this force unwrap is a little safer. We don't know if we can find that top view controller, a little dangerous. So instead of this, what we're going to do is get the top view controller and then set that as the delegate. So where are we? So self would be the view model, but we're actually going to get the top view controller. So before we even kick this off, let's just say guard let top VC equals utilities dot shared dot top view controller else. And let's just return for now. And then if we get this top VC, we'll set the top VC as the context provider here. All right. And we're going to have this start sign in with Apple flow. We're just going to call it from this function, which is connected to our button. This function is asynchronous. We're going to make it asynchronous later. For now, this is not really asynchronous, but I think it will work. All right. So let's go ahead and build this. All right, so we built our app here and let's try to sign in with Apple. Let's click the button and that modal appears. Awesome. So now it's going to ask you to sign in to your Apple ID. And I'm going to go through the motions, but before I do, I want to point out that this modal did appear, which means that we did perform requests. So we got this controller and we found that top view controller and now we're performing requests. So this function and this function here have succeeded. This completed without throwing an error. That doesn't mean that the user is signed in yet. Once we finish this, if I click the X button, the delegate method down here, the did complete with error will trigger. So I'll click that now and we'll see sign in with Apple error occurred. We got that print out in the console. If I click this again and I go through and it's successful, then this is going to run. So this is going to get that token and then sign in through the Firebase console. If I did everything right, it should log us into our app. So I'm going to go through the motions here. All right. And if you did it successfully, you're now logged into your app, which is awesome. And we even have this printout from before of our providers coming through. So we can see the provider is Apple. Let's jump to the Firebase documentation quick. Let's go into our authentication screen and we can now see that Apple is coming through as the auth provider for this account. So again, a unique ID and we signed in with Apple. Awesome. That is it for signing with Apple, and it's working completely. If you are doing this in your app, obviously you want to handle the errors as well. So if this fails, you would want to handle that. If this delegate method did complete with error comes through, you want to handle that. If we can't unwrap this and get these values, you want to handle that. But before we finish this video, I want to take this one step further and clean up the code and isolate the sign in with Apple logic to its own file, like we did here, sign in with Google. I think this is definitely something that I would do in all of my production apps, because like right now, the view model is really coupled to, as all of our sign in with Apple logic. And really, we don't need the view model to have this logic, especially if we decided to get rid of it. We wanted to move this to another app or another screen. All this code isn't totally reusable right now. So let's move it to another file. And to do this, it's going to be a little bit trickier than the sign in with Google. We're going to have to do a little bit of hackiness to get it to work perfectly, but you guys can follow along. I think it'll be a good sample of how to hack something together in Swift. So let's create another file, just like we did sign in with Google Helper. We're going to do a new file with a sign in Apple Helper. Great. And let's start by taking our sign in with Apple result and moving it into that file. Let's also take our sign in with Apple button view representable, move it into that file. In order to access all of this, we need to import authentication services into this file, right? And CryptoKit as well, we're going to need. So let's delete these from this first file, move them into here. We also need to import UIKit. And we can delete, did we import UIKit in this file? UIKit? Guess not. Cannot find UI view representable. Oh, we need to import SwiftUI for access to this. Cool. I'm coming back here. All right. So let's see. Start signing with Apple flow. Let's move this function to the other file. We're also going to want to move the nonce string and the SHA function. So let's cut all that and move that over to our helper file. Let's create a final class and call this SignInAppleHelper. Open the brackets, paste these functions in here. Cool. Some of these errors we got here, let's see, the top view controller is isolated to the main actor. So let's put this whole class on the main actor as well. Should get rid of that one. Current nonce. So let's go back to our view. Let's just take this current nonce, move it over here. Let's come back. Let's move our delegate methods. So I'm going to cut these. I'm also going to cut the UI view controller method. And let's go back into our helper, come down at the bottom and paste these in. Of course, now we want to extend our new helper class. So sign in Apple Helper. And we still have the same function here. The only difference is they did sign in with Apple, which we do not have because that's related to our view and it's related to our view and we don't have that in the helper class. We're going to fix that in a second. We need to conform to NSObject like we did before. So up here, we will conform to NSObject. We go back and get rid of this because this no longer needs to conform to NSObject. All right, looking pretty good so far. All right, now just like we did up here, let's create our helper and go with this. So we'll say, let. All right, now we're gonna have to use a completion handler, which means we want our helper to stay alive and not get deallocated while we are doing this asynchronous method. So I'm gonna put the helper for Apple actually in this class. So we'll say let helper equals sign in Apple helper. And then here we're going to let's call this sign in Apple helper for now. Here we're going to call sign in Apple helper dot start sign in with Apple flow. Now we got to look at this real quick. So firstly, this function is public, so we can access it. This is private. That's correct. And this is private. Cool. So what's going to happen is we're going to call this function and then it's going to perform requests and it's going to execute our delegate methods down here. The problem is we need to kick that back to where we called this function from, right? And so we don't have a way to then call this and go back to our app. So what we're going to do is actually add a completion handler here called, let's say, completion, which is an escaping function, and it will be a function that returns nothing, so void. And what do we want to actually return back to our application? Well, it's either going to be a success or a failure, right? Because we're either going to sign in or we're not. So let's make sure it's a result. And then the result needs two types. It needs a success value, which I'll just do a string for a second, and some sort of error. Now the success value, let's come down here and see what we have at the success state. So we have these tokens, which is the success state. This function accessing our auth manager, this is unique to my app right now, right? The SignInWithAppleHelper is going to be generic, so I can use it in any application that I have. Whereas this is another file in my app currently. So we're going to actually remove this from our app right now. So I'm going to cut this and let's go back to our auth manager. Sorry, let's go back to our authentication view. And we're going to need to implement this somehow in this code afterward. Let's go back real quick. And so now we have these tokens and we want to call that completion handler that we were setting up. These tokens are of type sign in with Apple result. So that's what we're going to send back. So our completion handler is going to send a result back of sign in with Apple result or error. All right. So if we can't get the top view controller, we should probably send back an error. So I'll call the completion handler right here and we'll call failure, pass in an error, URL error, bad URL. Why not? You can make your own custom errors later. Is there any other errors in this function? No, there is not. But so now when we get down to the bottom here, there's a potential error here, there's a potential error here, and there's a success value here. And the question is, how do we then call that completion handler from this function here? And what we're going to do is basically the same thing we're doing with this nonce. So this nonce, we create it here, and then we set a local value to the nonce. So in the instance of this class, we're holding a reference to the nonce so that we can access it later. And so later in our delegate method here, we still can find that nonce because it's still held in that class. And we're going to do the same thing for the completion handler. We're basically going to add a private var. I'm going to call this completion. Let's call it completion handler to be a little more of type. And what is this going to be? Well, it's going to be this right here. This is a function that returns void. I'm going to copy and paste that. Now, when we initialize this class before we call sign in with Apple Flow, we don't actually have this completion. So we are going to wrap this in parentheses and actually make it optional so that it is set equal to nil when the class starts. And then we want to set it when we start our flow. So right here, just in the same way we set the current nonce, we're going to set the completion equal to, let's actually call this completion handler. We're going to set the completion handler equal to the completion that we passed in. So now we have access to this function from anywhere in this class, and we can call it later. So coming down here, we are going to here call the completion handler, and this will be a failure. Do another URL error. Bad server response, maybe. Here's another one, and here's another one, and we'll just leave the print statement there, and we'll say, I don't know, cannot find host. And then we obviously have our success case. So we'll call our completion handler success, and we got to pass in the result, which is the tokens here. I hope you guys are following along. This is definitely harder code, and it is optional because it's equal to nil at the beginning. So we could just put a question mark here. So if it is valid, we will call it, which we know it will be valid by the time we get to these functions. This is definitely more complex and advanced code if you are just following my course, but I hope this is making sense to you guys. All right. So now we can call this, and we got to add in a completion handler, and then hopefully it'll work in our app still. Let's go back to our authentication view. Let's call start sign in with Apple flow. We get our completion handler, and this is the result. And now all we need to do is switch on the result. And we have a success case where we get back the sign in with Apple result. So this is going to be success. I'm going to call this the sign in Apple result. And we're actually not even going to do anything with it. If we get the success, we're just going to set self.didSignInWithApple equal to true. Otherwise here we are going to get the error. I'm going to call this error, and we can just print out the error. For now, we don't need to really handle it. Oh, sorry guys. This sign in with Apple result, we do need to then call the Firebase SDK. Oh my God, so many steps. All right, so in here, we're actually going to add a task to call the Firebase SDK with the sign in with Apple result. And then if that is successful, we will set self.didSignInWithApple to true. Okay. See if our errors go away. Yes, we need to add self here. I am aware that this is a strong reference to self. This is referencing this class here, which is where we have our helper, which is where we have our did sign in with Apple. But during this process, this view model will always be alive. I'm not worried about memory leaks in this file right now. So a lot of code. I guess let's see if it works, right? So let's run. All right, we're signed in. Let's sign out. I'm going to go sign in with Apple again. Our modal's still showing. That's good. I'm going to sign in and see if it actually works. And I am back in. Awesome. It is definitely working. All right, we got one more step to make our code even better. And that is, of course, these completion handlers are outdated because we like async await. We like Swift concurrency. So if I go back into this function, in Swift concurrency, you can convert a function with a completion handler into Swift concurrency by using something called a checked throwing continuation. I have a whole video on this on my channel in the Swift concurrency course. Towards the end, I think there's a continuations video. Go check that out. We're going to make one right now. And basically what we're going to do is the same name as this function, except this one's going to be asynchronous throws, and it will return a sign in Apple result. So we're getting the same result here with an error. So we're throwing the error or we're returning the result, and it's asynchronous. So instead of using a completion handler, we're just going to use Swift concurrency. What we're going to do is call this function within a continuation. So we will with checked throwing continuation. There are two types of continuations. One throws, one does not. This one obviously throws because we are going to get a possible error. So we want the throwing one. We're going to call this continuation. And then we want to call this function. So we're going to say self.startSignInWithAppleFlow with the completion handler here. Let's call this the result. And again, let's switch on the result, just like we did before. Now this success, I'm going to call this sign in Apple result. This failure, I'm going to call error. Now, when you're in a continuation, you want to always continue it one time. You cannot continue it two times. It will crash your application. So if we get this success, let's call continuation.resume. So we're going to continue it by returning the sign in with Apple result, and we're going to return out of this function. I'm going to be very explicit here. So if we get to this and we would continue, close out of this function because I absolutely do not want to call this continuation twice. Same thing here. We're going to call continuation.resume, but this time we're going to throw an error, and we'll pass in our error and we will return out just in case. And of course, this is checked throwing continuation and it is asynchronous. So we need to try await this value. All right, now we can call this asynchronous function from our code, which should look a little bit cleaner, I think. So I'm going to go back to my auth view, and we're going to try to basically resemble this now. So I'm going to take my helper. We'll say let helper equals sign in Apple helper. We're going to call let tokens equal try await helper dot sign in with Apple flow. And then we could even just call this sign in if we wanted to. And then same thing we did here. We're just going to do it here. Same thing we did here. We're going to do it here. Start signing with Apple, and we're going to pass in our tokens. All right, so now we don't need all of this. And the beautiful part about this is that we now know that if this function completes, it did successfully do everything. So now in our code, we can actually revert back. Instead of using this onChange method, we can revert back to the show sign in view, which is the same as we did with the Google one. And we can get rid of this published variable up here. If some of you are wondering, there is a very important difference between having the helper here and having the helper here. The reason we can do it here now is because of the way Swift concurrency works. Basically, when we call this function now, this function is not going to complete. So we're not going to get to the end of this line right here until this happens, and then this happens, and then the function will end. Whereas before, so let me edit undo real quick. So if I come back to our completion handler here, the difference is this completion handler, right, executes at one time at one point in time, and then this completion handler executes at a separate point in time. So when we were calling our function, the function actually completed when this completed, and then this was totally separate function that we called at a separate time. And so between those two functions, we wanted to make sure our helper stayed alive in our view model. However, now it's all part of this one asynchronous flow. So we know that this function is never going to complete until this finishes and this finishes. So this will not get deallocated until this completes, which makes our life super simple. Gotta love Swift concurrency. Hope that makes sense. Definitely very difficult stuff in the end of this video, but that's where we are at. All right, a lot of stuff. Let's just make sure that this works before we wrap up the video. I'm going to run the app. I'm going to log out. I'm going to log back in. Looks like it's working. Actually finish the flow here. And we're back in the app. Awesome. All right, guys, that was Sign In with Apple. And we had to do a lot of hacking together to get this together. You would honestly think that Apple would make it extremely easy to sign in with Apple, and they do, I guess, but just not if you want to do it with Firebase or any other third-party auth provider. So what we had to do is create a custom Sign In with Apple button view representable, converting the UIKit version to SwiftUI. And then we needed to create Sign In with Apple flow, which includes importing CryptoKit, creating a nonce string, creating a hash value from that nonce, presenting that, conforming to some delegate methods, and then figuring out how to get that data back from the completions back into our application, which we use the completion handler for. And finally, we converted that completion handler into a Swift concurrency flow using async await, using a check throwing continuation. And now we have some, I would say, pretty awesome code in our app. And look how simple this is, right? Like if I needed to do this in another app now, all I need to do is copy and paste the helper file, start the flow, and now I'm good and I get my tokens automatically. Never have to do this again. Just like in the last video with Sign In with Google, I will point out that I do have a Sign In with Apple helper already pre-made as a gist on my GitHub. So github.com/swiftfulthinking. You guys are welcome to use my Sign In with Apple helper, which is more or less the function that we just made. The slight differences, but basically the same stuff is going to happen. Overall, I wrote some actual custom errors rather than using those URL errors, and hopefully that helps somebody. All right, and just like in the last video with the Sign In with Google, I forgot to get the user's information basically from the Sign In with Apple. So when we sign them in with Apple, we actually do get access to their Apple profile, right? We requested the scope for the name and the email, but we forgot to pull that back out when we actually got it. So sorry that I forgot that, but basically we can come down, basically in the Sign In with Apple result, we can add in a name of type string. We'll make it optional, as well as an email of type string. And so every time we create a Sign In with Apple result, which looks like it's this one time here, we want to add in a name as well as and email. And so we can get that from the Apple credential. We can say let name equals the credential dot full name. And I think we want to convert that to a string, maybe by using the, let's see here, use the given name. I think family name is their last name and given name is their first name. I could be wrong. You guys can play around with this. I think depending on how they set up their Apple profile, some of these are going to be nil and some will not be. So there's definitely a world where you might want to like get a bunch of them and check for whichever one is valid. But we're just going to go with the given name for now. And then also we can check out their email that comes back as well. So we'll make this our email and we'll pass these in to our function. Just like in the sign in with Google, I forgot to do this the first time around. I'm coming back and adding this to the video. So when we go and start writing this to our database, my data model is not going to include the name and email, but yours probably should. All right, that was it. We now have 3 different auth methods in our application. We have sign in with email, sign in with Google, sign in with Apple. Definitely the 3 most common. And now we're just going to wrap up in the next video where we do anonymous authentication. So we actually don't do an SSO. We just automatically authenticate every user. All right. That one's going to be much easier than this one. This is probably the hardest video in this playlist. So I hope I didn't scare you guys. And if you're with me, I will see you in the next video.